On the morning of March 14, 2005, in a quiet neighborhood just west of Miami's glittering downtown, a woman named Claudia Reyes stepped out of her townhouse to drive to work at the medical clinic, where she'd been a receptionist for 6 years. She wore her usual Monday uniform, navy scrubs, white sneakers, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her husband, Marcus Thompson, a soft-spoken electrician with steady work throughout Dade County, had already left an hour earlier for a commercial job in Coral Gables. Their daughter, 8-year-old Sophia, was spending spring break week with Claudia's mother in Hialeah. The house at 2847 West Flagler Street was empty. Claudia locked the door behind her, set her purse on the passenger seat of her silver Honda Accord, and turned the key in the ignition. She never made it to work that day. By noon, her supervisor had called her cell phone 4 times. By 2 in the afternoon, worried colleagues contacted Marcus. By 4:30, when Marcus arrived home to an empty house with Claudia's car missing from the driveway and no note, no message, no explanation, he called the police. 36 hours later, Claudia's vehicle was discovered in a remote section of the Everglades. Driver's door open, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the seat with wallet, cash, and identification untouched. Claudia herself was gone. The question that would haunt Miami-Dade County for the next 18 years was devastatingly simple. Where was Claudia Reyes, and what had happened in those missing hours between her front door and that abandoned car in the Sawgrass? West Flagler Street in 2005 was a neighborhood in transition, caught between Miami's old working-class roots and the city's relentless push toward modernization. The townhouses along that particular stretch had been built in the late 90s, modest 2-story units with beige stucco exteriors and small, fenced yards. Royal palms lined the sidewalks. In March, the jacaranda trees were just beginning to bloom, dropping purple petals onto the hot pavement. The community was predominantly Latino and Caribbean, families who worked service jobs and trades, who knew their neighbors' names, who left their doors unlocked during the day. Crime existed, certainly, but violent crime was rare on this particular block. People barbecued on weekends. Children rode bicycles in tight circles in the cul-de-sac. Claudia Reyes had lived there for 3 years. Those who knew her described a woman of remarkable consistency. She rose every weekday at 6:15 in the morning. She made café con leche in a small stovetop espresso maker, always 2 cups, one for herself and one for Marcus. She ate half a piece of toast with butter. She showered, dressed, applied minimal makeup, a touch of mascara and lip gloss, nothing more. She left the house by 7:30 to arrive at the Westwood Medical Center by 8 o'clock, where she greeted patients with the same warm smile, asked about their families, remembered their children's names. Her supervisor, Dr. Elena Porras, would later tell investigators that Claudia had never been late, not once in 6 years. She had never called in sick without genuine cause. She was, in Dr. Porras's words, the most reliable person I have ever employed. Marcus Thompson was a different kind of steady. A man of few words, he'd grown up in Liberty City, the son of a single mother who'd worked double shifts as a nurse's aide. He'd learned electrical work through a vocational program, built a small but solid reputation for quality installations and fair prices. He and Claudia had met at a cousin's wedding in 2000. Married 8 months later in a small ceremony at a Catholic church in Little Havana. Their daughter Sophia had arrived a year after that, a bright-eyed girl with her mother's dimples and her father's quiet thoughtfulness. Friends described their marriage as stable, unremarkable in the best possible way. They argued occasionally, usually about money or Marcus's long work hours, but never loud enough for neighbors to hear. They attended church most Sundays at Our Lady of Guadalupe. They paid their bills on time. The morning of March 14th began like any Monday. Marcus had left the house at 6:30, driving his white work van to a job site where he was rewiring the electrical system in a new office building. He'd packed his lunch, kissed Claudia on the forehead, reminded her to call her mother about picking up Sophia later in the week. Claudia had smiled, told him to drive carefully, locked the door behind him. The next hours were ordinary, invisible, the kind of routine that leaves no trace. She showered. She dressed. She gathered her things. At 7:28 in the morning, a neighbor, Mrs. Carmen Suarez, was watering her hibiscus plants in the front yard 2 houses down. She saw Claudia walk to her car, saw her pause to pick up a flyer that had been left on her windshield, saw her get into the Honda and back out of the driveway. Mrs. Suarez waved. Claudia waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting of Claudia Reyes by anyone who knew her. Clear's throat. What happened in the next 8 hours would be constructed later through fragments. A gas station receipt time-stamped at 7:41 a.m., showing Claudia had stopped for fuel at the Shell station 3 blocks from her home. A traffic camera caught her Honda heading south on Lejeune Road at 7:52 a.m., consistent with her usual route to work. Then nothing. No further camera sightings. No cell phone activity after 7:33 a.m., when she'd sent a text message to her mother confirming dinner plans for the following Sunday. No credit card purchases. No ATM withdrawals. The Honda Accord seemed to vanish from the urban landscape entirely, as if it had driven into some invisible fold in the city and disappeared. At the Westwood Medical Center, Dr. Porras noticed Claudia's absence immediately. The waiting room began filling at 8 o'clock with patients for morning appointments. By 8:15, with no sign of Claudia and no phone call, Dr. Porras began making calls herself. Claudia's cell phone rang through to voicemail. Her home phone, an aging landline they kept mostly for Sophia to call her grandmother, rang unanswered. By 9 o'clock, Dr. Porras was worried. By 10, she was frightened. She called Claudia's mother, who hadn't heard from her daughter since the previous evening. She called Marcus's cell phone, reaching him on a job site. Marcus Thompson's reaction, according to Dr. Porras, was immediate concern but not panic. He said he was sure there was an explanation, Dr. Porras told detectives later. He said maybe she'd had car trouble, maybe her phone had died. He said he'd go home and check, call me back. Marcus left the job site at 10:20 in the morning. He arrived home at 11:15. The house was exactly as he'd left it. Claudia's coffee cup sat in the sink, rinsed but not washed. The bed was made with hospital corners, her habit. The bathroom counter held her usual morning items, displaced but present. Everything was ordinary except for Claudia's absence. Marcus called her cell phone again. He called area hospitals. He called her 2 closest friends, her sister in Tampa, her cousin who lived in Kendall. No one had heard from her. At 4:37 in the afternoon, Marcus Thompson called the Miami-Dade Police Department to report his wife missing. The dispatcher took his information with routine efficiency. Adult missing person. Last seen that morning. Driving a 2003 silver Honda Accord, license plate FLM 832. The report was filed. Because Claudia was an adult with no history of mental illness, no known threats against her life, and had been missing less than 12 hours. The case was logged but not immediately escalated. Marcus spent that evening calling everyone they knew. Claudia's mother drove over, bringing Sophia, breaking the news to the child that Mama hadn't come home from work, inventing a story about car trouble to keep the girl calm. They waited. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, cell phone in hand, jumping at every sound. Claudia's mother prayed the rosary in Spanish, the beads clicking softly between her fingers. Sophia fell asleep on the couch, still in her day clothes. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. Night fell. The porch light stayed on. Claudia did not come home. The next morning, March 15th, Marcus called the police again. This time, his voice carried more urgency. The responding officer, a veteran named Detective Robert Cordero, arrived at the house at 9:30 a.m. He took detailed notes. He asked about marital problems, financial stress, drug use, extramarital affairs. Marcus answered each question with the same quiet steadiness. No problems, no drugs, no affairs not that he knew of. Their marriage was good, she was happy. She loved her daughter. She would never leave voluntarily. Detective Cordero noted that Marcus maintained eye contact, showed appropriate distress, answered without hesitation. He seemed genuinely confused and frightened. At 11 o'clock that morning, Detective Cordero initiated a more active search. Claudia's photograph was distributed to patrol units. Her cell phone records were subpoenaed. Her bank accounts were flagged for any activity. A bolo, be on the lookout, was issued for her vehicle. The medical clinic was contacted for any insight into Claudia's state of mind, any unusual behavior in recent days or weeks. Everyone said the same thing. Claudia was normal, stable content. There had been no warning signs. Then, at 2:47 in the afternoon on March 16th, 48 hours after Claudia was last seen, a call came into the police department from a ranger with the National Park Service. A silver Honda Accord matching the description in the bolo had been found in a remote access area of Everglades National Park, approximately 37 miles southwest of Claudia's home. The driver's door was open. The keys were in the ignition. A woman's purse sat on the passenger seat. The investigation, the location where Claudia's Honda was discovered, was known locally as Gator Hook Trail, a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main park route and dead-ended at a boat launch used primarily by airboat tour operators and occasional fishermen. It was not a place someone stumbled upon accidentally. You had to know it existed. You had to turn off the paved road, drive past a small, easily missed sign, and follow the rutted path through sawgrass and palmetto scrub for nearly a mile before reaching the water's edge. The area was isolated, swampy, thick with mosquitoes and the constant background noise of insects and birds. The nearest residence was 4 miles away. Cell phone reception was spotty at best. When Detective Cordero arrived at the scene at 4 o'clock that afternoon, accompanied by a team from the Miami-Dade Police Department's Missing Persons Unit, he found the Honda parked at an angle near the boat launch, as if someone had pulled in hastily and abandoned it. The driver's door hung open. The interior was hot from sitting in the Florida sun for 2 days, the vinyl seats almost too hot to touch. Claudia's purse sat undisturbed on the passenger seat, a black leather bag containing her wallet, $117 in cash, her credit cards, her driver's license, a tube of lip gloss, a small pack of tissues, her work ID badge, and her cell phone. The phone was turned off. When technicians powered it on, it showed a full charge. Clear as throat, there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no damage to the vehicle. The car started immediately when an officer turned the key. The gas tank showed a quarter full, consistent with Claudia having filled up that morning and driven approximately the distance from her home to this location. The odometer reading, when compared against service records from Claudia's mechanic, showed she'd driven roughly 39 miles since her last oil change 2 weeks prior, a distance that aligned with her daily commute plus the trip to the Everglades. Search and rescue teams were deployed immediately. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, 20 officers and rangers were combing the area around the boat launch. They moved in a grid pattern, walking slowly through the sawgrass, looking for any sign of Claudia. Clothing, footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything. Cadaver dogs were brought in at dusk, German shepherds trained to detect human remains. They sniffed the interior of the Honda, walked the perimeter of the boat launch, waded into the shallow water at the marsh edge. The dogs showed no alerts. By nightfall, with flashlights cutting through the darkness and the swamp alive with the sounds of unseen creatures, the search teams found nothing. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. By March 17th, Claudia's disappearance was front-page news in the Miami Herald. Her photograph, a recent family portrait showing her smiling beside Marcus with Sophia on her lap, appeared on local television stations. The headline read, "Mother Missing, Car Found Abandoned in Everglades." A tip line was established. Volunteers organized search parties. Flyers with Claudia's face were posted on telephone poles, store windows, bus stops throughout Miami-Dade County. Claudia's mother appeared on camera, speaking in broken English and rapid Spanish, begging for anyone with information to come forward. Sophia, kept home from school, drew pictures of her mother, placing them on the kitchen table as if displaying them would bring Claudia back. Marcus Thompson was cooperative with investigators from the start, almost excessively so. He provided detailed alibis for March 14th, including the names and phone numbers of 4 coworkers who could verify his presence at the Coral Gables job site from 7 in the morning, until he'd received Dr. Porres's call at 10:15. He gave permission for police to search his home, his work van, his financial records. He took a polygraph examination on March 18th, answering questions about his marriage, his whereabouts, whether he'd harmed his wife. He passed the polygraph. Detectives found no evidence linking him to Claudia's disappearance. His cell phone records showed no suspicious calls. His credit cards showed no unusual purchases. His coworkers confirmed he'd been at work all day. By all measurable standards, Marcus Thompson was not a suspect. But those who worked the case began to notice small things, details that didn't quite align. Detective Cordero, in his notes from March 19th, wrote, "Subject maintains unusual composure. Shows concern but not the emotional breakdown one would expect. Answers questions almost too precisely, as if rehearsed." During one interview, when asked what he thought had happened to Claudia, Marcus had sat silently for a long moment before saying, "I don't know. Maybe she needed to get away for a while." The statement struck investigators as odd. Get away from what? When pressed, Marcus couldn't articulate an answer. He just repeated that he didn't know, that nothing made sense. Other inconsistencies began to surface. A coworker of Marcus's mentioned, almost in passing, that Marcus had seemed distracted on March 14th, that he'd made several phone calls during the morning and seemed agitated when he returned from lunch, which was unusual for him. The coworker couldn't remember exact times, but estimated Marcus had been on his phone around 9:30 and again around noon. Marcus's phone records showed calls to Claudia's cell at those times, consistent with his story that he'd been trying to reach her after Dr. Porres called him. But there was something about the way he'd behaved that day, the coworker said, something off that was hard to describe. Then there was the matter of the route. Investigators mapped the drive from the Reyes-Thompson home to the Everglades location where the Honda was found. The most direct route was 37.2 miles, taking approximately 48 minutes in light traffic. Claudia had been captured on traffic camera heading south at 7:52 a.m., roughly on course for her work commute. For her to have ended up at Gator Hook Trail, she would have had to divert from her route sometime before 8:30 and drive in the opposite direction. There was no logical reason for this detour. She wasn't meeting anyone, according to her phone records and calendar. She had no history of visiting the Everglades. She'd never mentioned any interest in the area to family or friends. Forensic analysis of the Honda yielded few answers. Fingerprints inside the vehicle belonged to Claudia, Marcus, Sophia, and Claudia's mother, all explainable. There were no unknown prints, no signs of forced entry, no indication anyone else had been in the car. Fiber analysis found nothing unusual. DNA swabs came back clean except for family members. The car, mechanically, was in good condition. There was no reason it would have broken down. The keys in the ignition suggested Claudia or someone had intended to return to the vehicle. People who abandon a car usually take the keys. The investigation expanded. Detectives interviewed Claudia's friends, coworkers, acquaintances. They built a timeline of her life in the weeks before her disappearance, looking for any sign of distress, any unusual behavior, any secret that might explain why a seemingly content wife and mother would vanish. They found nothing. Claudia had been planning Sophia's 9th birthday party, scheduled for early April. She'd made a payment on their car loan on March 10th. She'd scheduled a dentist appointment for March 21st. These were not the actions of someone preparing to disappear. Deputies began to whisper quietly among themselves about the husband. It was always the husband, the old wisdom went, especially when there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of stranger abduction, no ransom demand, nothing. But Marcus Thompson's alibi was solid. His polygraph was clean. His demeanor, while perhaps unusual, wasn't evidence of guilt. Still, Detective Cordero couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was a piece of the story he wasn't seeing. In his notes from March 25th, he wrote, "Husband too calm, answers too practiced, but where's the evidence? Where's the motive? And if he did something to her, how did he do it when he was at work all day?" Weeks passed. The search efforts in the Everglades continued intermittently, but the swamp was vast, over 1.5 million acres of wetland where a body could sink into the muck and never be found. Cadaver dogs returned multiple times, always with the same negative results. Dive teams searched the water near the boat launch. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the area. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the sawgrass until their legs were cut and bleeding from the sharp blades. They found nothing, no clothing, no belongings, no trace of Claudia Reyes beyond her abandoned car. By June 2005, the case began to slow. The media attention faded. The volunteer search parties dwindled. The tip line calls became less frequent, mostly from psychics and well-meaning but unhelpful witnesses reporting sightings of women who looked nothing like Claudia. Detective Cordero continued working the case, but other investigations demanded attention. Claudia's file remained open, unsolved but no longer active. The official status became missing person, circumstances unknown. The unspoken consensus among investigators was that Claudia Reyes was dead, that her body was somewhere in that vast swamp, and that they might never find her. The question of how she'd ended up there, whether by her own hand or someone else's, remained unanswered. Marcus Thompson returned to work. He moved through his days with the same quiet efficiency, installing outlets, running wire through walls, coming home to an empty house. Claudia's mother took Sophia more often, concerned about the girl growing up in a home shadowed by loss and uncertainty. Marcus didn't object. He seemed hollow, people said, like something essential had been carved out of him. Those who knew him said he stopped attending church. He stopped answering calls from Claudia's family. He lived in silence, a ghost in his own life. The silence by the fall of 2006, 18 months after Claudia's disappearance, Marcus Thompson had relocated. He sold the townhouse on West Flagler Street, the place too full of memories, and moved to a small rental duplex in Kendall, farther south, farther from the neighborhood where everyone knew his story. Sophia, now 9 years old, lived primarily with her grandmother in Hialeah, visiting Marcus on weekends, though these visits became increasingly sporadic as the months passed. Marcus had started dating someone new, a woman named Jennifer Walsh he'd met through work, a dispatcher for the electrical supply company he frequently ordered materials from. Jennifer was 32, divorced, no children of her own. She knew about Claudia, about the investigation, about the cloud that hung over Marcus's life. She chose to see past it, believing his story that he was a grieving husband trying to move forward. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the subtle wrongness of a story that doesn't quite add up but can't pinpoint exactly why, what happened next will feel familiar. Jennifer Walsh moved into Marcus's duplex in January 2007. They built a life that looked, from the outside, remarkably normal. Marcus continued his electrical work. Jennifer managed her dispatching job. They grocery shopped together, watched television in the evenings, argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. But underneath the surface, there was a weight, a tension that Jennifer couldn't quite name. Marcus didn't talk about Claudia. He'd mentioned her briefly when they first met, explained the basics of her disappearance, but after that, he shut down any conversation about her. When Jennifer asked questions, trying to understand what he'd been through, Marcus would change the subject or leave the room. He kept no photos of Claudia visible in the house. Sophia's visits grew less frequent, once a month, then every other month, until by 2008 the child barely came at all. Marcus didn't fight for more time with his daughter. He seemed almost relieved when Sophia's grandmother suggested it might be easier for the girl to stay in Hialeah full-time. Jennifer noticed other things. Marcus had nightmares occasionally, waking in the middle of the night, sitting up in bed breathing hard, but he never explained what he dreamed. He was meticulous about his schedule, almost obsessive, always needing to know where Jennifer was when she'd be home, who she'd been talking to. It wasn't controlling exactly, but it was watchful in a way that made her uncomfortable. Once when Jennifer suggested they take a weekend trip to the Keys, Marcus had refused adamantly, saying he didn't like being far from home. When she pressed, asking why, he'd snapped at her, something he rarely did, and said he just didn't want to go. The conversation ended there. In the summer of 2009, 4 years after Claudia's disappearance, Jennifer became pregnant. Marcus's reaction was muted, more anxiety than joy. He worried constantly about money, about space in the small duplex, about whether he could handle being a father again. Jennifer tried to reassure him, tried to understand his fears as stemming from the loss of his first family, but his behavior grew more erratic. He started drinking more, a beer or two after work becoming 3 or 4. He stayed late at job sites, coming home after dark, saying he needed the overtime but never showing Jennifer the extra money on his paychecks. Their daughter, Emily, was born in February 2010. Marcus was present at the hospital, held the baby, smiled for photos, but Jennifer could see the distance in his eyes. In the weeks after Emily's birth, when Jennifer was exhausted and overwhelmed, Marcus was absent in every way that mattered. He went to work early, came home late, spent weekends doing side jobs. When Jennifer confronted him, he said they needed the money that he was providing for his family. But Jennifer felt alone, raising a newborn in a relationship that felt increasingly fragile. Sophia, now 14, came to visit once in early 2010, meeting her half-sister for the first time. The girl was quiet, watchful, uncomfortable in her father's home. She stayed for dinner, held Emily briefly, then asked her grandmother to pick her up early. Jennifer watched Sophia leave and saw something in the teenager's face, a kind of knowing sadness that children shouldn't carry. Later, when Jennifer asked Marcus about his relationship with Sophia, why they weren't closer, he shrugged and said the girl blamed him for her mother's disappearance. When Jennifer asked if that was true, if Sophia really blamed him, Marcus had looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and said, "Kids believe what they're told." The marriage began to fracture. Jennifer and Marcus argued more frequently, about money, about his absences, about his refusal to talk about anything meaningful. Jennifer started noticing inconsistencies in his stories, small things that didn't add up. Once he said he'd been working a job in Homestead all day, but when Jennifer called his cell phone during lunch, the background noise sounded like he was somewhere else, somewhere with wind and open space, not a construction site. When she mentioned it, he'd said she must have been hearing things, that job sites could be windy. Another time, she'd found a receipt in his truck for gas purchased in Florida City, near the entrance to the Everglades, on a day he'd told her he was working in North Miami. When she asked about it, he'd become defensive, said he must have driven down there for materials, couldn't remember specifically. Clears throat in December 2012, 7.5 years after Claudia Reyes disappeared, Jennifer Walsh packed a bag and left Marcus Thompson. She took Emily, then 2 years old, and moved in with her sister in Fort Lauderdale. She didn't file for divorce immediately, just needed space, needed to think. But in the months that followed, living away from Marcus, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. She realized she'd been living in the shadow of something she didn't understand, something dark and unspoken that Marcus carried with him. She started to wonder about Claudia Reyes, about what had really happened that morning in March 2005, about whether the man she'd built a life with was capable of things she didn't want to imagine. In March 2013, Jennifer did something she'd never done before. She went online and read everything she could find about Claudia's disappearance. She read newspaper articles, watched old news broadcasts, found discussion forums where amateur detectives speculated about the case. She learned details Marcus had never told her, that Claudia's car had been found in a remote area of the Everglades, that there'd been no signs of struggle, that Marcus had been at work when Claudia vanished, but that investigators had never completely ruled him out. She read about how the case had gone cold, how no body had ever been found, how Marcus had passed a polygraph but some detectives still had doubts. Reading these details, Jennifer felt something shift inside her. She thought about the nightmares, the secrecy, the way Marcus avoided certain places, the gas receipt from Florida City. Jennifer called the Miami-Dade Police Department in April 2013. She asked to speak to someone about the Claudia Reyes case. She was transferred to the cold case unit, where a detective named Angela Reyes, no relation to Claudia, took her call. Jennifer explained who she was, that she'd been involved with Marcus Thompson, that she had concerns, suspicions, nothing concrete but a feeling that something was wrong. Detective Angela Reyes listened, asked questions, took notes. When Jennifer mentioned the gas receipt from Florida City, the location near the Everglades, Detective Reyes asked if she still had it. Jennifer didn't. She asked if Jennifer had noticed any other unusual behavior, anything that stood out. Jennifer mentioned the nightmares, the refusal to talk about Claudia, the way Marcus had distanced himself from Sophia. Detective Reyes thanked her for calling, said she'd review the case file, said she'd be in touch if anything developed. Months passed. Jennifer heard nothing. She filed for divorce in August 2013. Marcus didn't contest it. They agreed on shared custody of Emily, though Marcus rarely exercised his visitation rights. The divorce was finalized in December 2013. Jennifer moved on with her life, dated someone new, focused on raising her daughter. She thought about Claudia Reyes sometimes, wondered if her phone call had led to anything, but mostly she tried to forget the years she'd spent with Marcus Thompson. The revelation Sophia Thompson was 19 years old in the summer of 2016, a college student at Florida International University studying nursing, following in her grandmother's footsteps. She lived in a dorm on campus, went home to Hialeah on weekends, had built a life separate from her father. She saw Marcus perhaps twice a year, awkward meetings at family events where they spoke politely but distantly, like strangers who happened to share a last name. Sophia had never fully processed her mother's disappearance. She'd been 8 years old when it happened, old enough to remember but young enough to have been shielded from the worst details. Her grandmother had told her that Mama had gone away, that God had called her home, that she was watching over Sophia from heaven. Sophia had believed this for years, had built a child's understanding of death and loss around these words. But as Sophia grew older, as she began to understand the world in more complex terms, she started asking questions. Why hadn't her mother's body ever been found? Why had her car been discovered in the Everglades? Why did her father never talk about what happened? Her grandmother deflected these questions, told Sophia it was better not to dwell on painful things, that some mysteries didn't have answers. But Sophia couldn't let it go. In 2015, during her freshman year of college, she'd gone to the library and pulled up archived newspaper articles about her mother's case. She'd read everything, absorbed every detail, and realized that the story she'd been told as a child was incomplete, that there were pieces missing, questions unanswered. In July 2016, Sophia did something she'd never done before. She agreed to meet with her father for lunch, just the two of them, at a small Cuban restaurant in Little Havana. Marcus arrived on time, looking older than Sophia remembered, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with fatigue. They ordered food, made small talk about Sophia's classes, the heat, trivial things. Then Sophia, gathering courage, asked her father directly, "What happened to my mother?" Marcus's face went still. He looked at his daughter across the table, his expression unreadable. He said, "You know what happened. She disappeared. They never found her," Sophia said. "But how did her car end up in the Everglades? Why would she go there?" Marcus said. "I don't know. The police investigated. They didn't find any answers." Sophia pressed further. She said, "Did you have anything to do with it?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his plate at the arroz con pollo he'd barely touched. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. He said, "No, I loved your mother. I would never have hurt her." But something in his tone, some quality Sophia couldn't name, made her not believe him. She looked at her father, this man she barely knew, and realized she was afraid of him. Not physically afraid, but afraid of what he might be capable of what secrets he carried. She finished the lunch quickly, made an excuse about needing to study, and left. She didn't speak to Marcus again. 3 months later, in October 2016, Sophia went to the police. She walked into the Miami-Dade Police Department's cold case unit and asked to speak to someone about her mother's case. She was directed to Detective Angela Reyes, the same detective who'd taken Jennifer Walsh's call 3 years earlier. Detective Reyes brought Sophia into an interview room, offered her water, asked how she could help. Sophia explained that she didn't have new evidence, didn't have proof of anything, but that she believed her father knew more than he'd told investigators. She described the lunch conversation, the way Marcus had answered her questions, the feeling she'd had that he was lying. She said, "I think he did something to her. I don't know what, but I think he knows where she is." Detective Reyes listened carefully. She told Sophia that the case had never been closed, that investigators had never stopped wondering what happened to Claudia. She explained that without new evidence, physical evidence, there was little they could do. But she promised Sophia that she would review the case file again, that she would look for anything that might have been missed. Sophia left the police station feeling both relieved and helpless, knowing she'd done what she could but uncertain whether it would lead anywhere. Detective Angela Reyes kept her promise. She pulled the Claudia Reyes file, a thick folder containing hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, forensic analyses, maps, photographs. She read through everything, looking for details that might have been overlooked in 2005. She noticed the same things Detective Cordero had noticed. Marcus Thompson's unusual composure, the lack of emotion, the precisely rehearsed answers. She read Jennifer Walsh's statement from 2013 about the gas receipt near the Everglades. She read Sophia's recent statement about her father's behavior. Separately, these were just observations, suspicions. Together, they suggested a pattern. Detective Reyes decided to re-interview people connected to the case. She tracked down Marcus's coworkers from 2005, the men who'd been working with him the day Claudia disappeared. Most remembered little. 11 years was a long time. But one man, a journeyman electrician named Carlos Mendez, recalled something he'd forgotten to mention in his original statement. He said Marcus had been late arriving to the job site that morning, had shown up around 7:45 instead of his usual 7 o'clock start time. Mendez hadn't thought much of it at the time. Traffic happened, but looking back, it struck him as unusual because Marcus was never late. Detective Reyes checked this against Marcus's original statement, where he'd said he arrived at work at 7 o'clock. It was a small discrepancy, 45 minutes, but it mattered. Detective Reyes pulled Marcus's cell phone records again, this time expanding the time frame to include the early morning hours of March 14th, 2005. She found something interesting. A call from Marcus's cell phone to Claudia's cell phone at 5:47 a.m., more than 30 minutes before Marcus claimed he'd left for work. The call lasted less than a minute. In his original statement, Marcus had said he'd left the house at 6:30, that Claudia was still getting ready, that they'd said goodbye at the door. But if he'd called her at 5:47, where was he calling from? And why hadn't he mentioned this call to investigators? Detective Reyes began to construct a new timeline. If Marcus had left the house earlier than he'd stated, say around 6 o'clock, and if Claudia had left shortly after at her usual time of 7:30, there would have been a window of time when the house was empty. But what would Marcus have been doing between 6 and 7:45, when he arrived late at work? Detective Reyes measured the driving distance.